We're going to go down to 13 on your sides. Callie Lichter, Callie, a lot has happened today. What are some of your key takeaways so far?
Well, I think that, two of the biggest takeaways for me personally was hearing the rest of the testimony from Nick Bloomfield, who we knew was also going to be a controversial witness for the defense. And then also those two motions that were filed by the defense, the motion for mistrial and then for the directed verdict. Now, again, those things aren't necessarily common. They're not uncommon. It's just another tool that's used, by usually the defense because they're trying everything that they can do to help their client, in this case, Christopher Schurr. But those two definitely stood out, and even though the cross-examination and the testimony that we heard from Bloomfield this morning wasn't the longest, it didn't go on for 4 hours like we saw yesterday with Seth Stoughton, it was, still very impactful, and I think we really started this morning off with a punch, Lauren.
Most definitely, Callie. And I wanted to get your perspective on those two different situations. It seemed like there was a lot of emotion in the two, not arguments, but back and forth between the prosecution, judge, and defense.
Just to be clear before I start, talking, because I can talk about this forever. Are you talking about the two motions that we heard earlier today?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, with these two motions, they, like you said, there was a lot of high emotions in that courtroom. I think that's kind of how we're trending in this trial. Again, like I've been saying this whole entire time, there are the two clear views that we have in there, and it's just that little difference, the intention, and then also was it justifiable. And so, of course, we've seen from the past couple of days before the trial that the defense did not want Stoughton and Bloomfield to take the stand, and time again, they've been denied by the judge. The judge kept on saying they can be expert witnesses, they can be on the stand, and this was kind of, their last attempt to try to, strike their testimony. That was the basis for the mistrial part. The defense believes that both Stoughton and Bloomfield, their testimony would, perjure their client, that their testimony was prejudicial, and by the jury hearing both of their testimonies, it would highly sway their way against their client. And so they said they wanted their testimonies struck from the record. So to be removed from the record, to act like, that's never happened, so that the jury members wouldn't take that into consideration. But they were also claiming that at this point in the trial, they were too far along to strike those two witnesses, to strike their testimonies. So that's why they were calling for a mistrial. They were saying, they believed we couldn't continue the trial unless we couldn't continue the trial if these two witnesses were still on the record. And then, immediately after, they kind of went into that directed verdict motion, which was something new that I heard today. Again, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a lawyer, but the directed motion, after talking to some experts on this, the directed verdict, should I say, is when they are claiming that after we've heard all the evidence from the prosecution, we heard Becker rest his case, that the jury, wouldn't be able to come to a verdict, that they didn't hear enough from the prosecution in order for the prosecution to make their case, make their claim. So at the end, when Judge Mims says, all right, I can make my decision on both of these, both on the mistrial motion and on the directed verdict motion, she said, I believe that these two testimonies were fair. She brought up, the defense also brought up, these two witnesses were talking about generally accepted police practices due to kind of like a national standard. They're not talking specifically about Michigan law. The defense said that they should, be referencing Michigan law. They're not experts in Michigan law, so they shouldn't be taking the stand. But while the defense was making their case for mistrial, they cited the Supreme Court of the United States, which is a national law of the land. And Judge Mims says, you're saying that they can't bring their expertise to the stand with this nationally recognized, kind of police practices, but you cited the Supreme Court in your decision. So she did end up, striking down, saying, I will not, agree to this motion for mistrial. And when it came to the directed verdict, she went through, the different things that the prosecution has to prove for their case, including, that intention and was this unjustifiable? And when judges are asked to make directed verdicts, they have to kind of err more on the side of the prosecution because that's all they've heard so far. And so she kind of went through her justification for each point, and she came to the conclusion that based on what she's heard, at least, again, she's not speaking to the jury for the jury. The jury is the ones who make the final decision in this case. The judge said based on what she's heard, she believes that the prosecution accurately represented their case, Lauren.
I wanted to ask you about the defense's first witness that we saw today. At some point, it seemed like there was a discussion about the evidence that they were bringing into the case, or rather the clips they were bringing into the case, and the prosecution either wanting to be shortened, or can you kind of break down what happened in that situation?
So it's from, what I'm observing, what I'm hearing, what's going on in the courtroom, that the defense was trying to almost create evidence to put into the file as we were going through the trial. So we're kind of going through, clip by clip, and it's no surprise it was taking a fairly long time. We're going through a couple seconds at a time, replaying those, zooming in on those, slowing down those, taking clips. So that's kind of what we were seeing on that end. The prosecution had an objection which was sustained about, it was almost an objection to just keep on moving things along. But Borgula did say, my client has the right for to share the evidence. The defense has the right to share the evidence that, the defendant, in this case again, Schurr, needs. And so he was arguing that this is completely necessary because they're allowed to share what evidence they believe helps their case. So at the end, kind of before we went into that lunch break, that was kind of the discussion there about, calling in Robert McFarland, who's the expert who we heard from, in later. He can kind of get his bearings. We can kind of do this on the sidelines until he can get called back in. So there's been a lot of discussion about that. So that's kind of what was going on from what I was able to see, Lauren.
And Callie, I know you're live at the courthouse and they will be resuming soon. So we're going to let you get back inside the courthouse. We again appreciate all of your reporting during this trial.